My 7-year-old daughter's imaginary friend, Mr. Patches, kept saying her baby brother's eyes needed to be fixed so he could see him too. Then I caught her standing over his crib at 3 a.m. with scissors, whispering, "This is the only way he'll forgive me." I always presumed my daughter Michaela was just shy, and that's why she didn't talk much, until I realized it's because of who she was hanging out with. You see, for as long as I could remember, Michaela never had many friends and struggled to socialize. I'll always remember the day my heart broke the most, watching her setting up a tea party with empty chairs, talking to them, and pretending someone was laughing at her jokes. It was around this time that Michaela started hanging out with a grown man named Mr. Patches. Mr. Patches was her imaginary friend, and at first, he seemed like a gift from the heavens. He gave her the type of confidence that kids can only get from friends, not family. I still remember how I felt when Michaela came home with her first birthday party invitation. Sarah broke down crying in the kitchen. Our baby was finally being included. But within a couple months, Michaela's life started revolving around Mr. Patches. She began having these long conversations in her room where we could hear both sides of the dialogue. She'd change her voice slightly for Mr. Patches. Her new friends from school refused to play at our house because Mr. Patches made them uncomfortable. Michaela would tell them things like, "Mr. Patches doesn't like how loud you breathe." I brought it up to my wife one night and she said, "F them. If they can't handle Michaela's quirks, they don't deserve to be her friend anyway." I agreed, because this was our precious Michaela we were talking about. It wasn't until Sarah found Michaela's drawings that she finally decided there was a problem, because right there on the sheets of paper was the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. Michaela had drawn a wholesome family portrait of us. I would have smiled like I always did whenever she drew us, but this time there was someone else with us. Behind us was this tall, dark figure with multiple arms and legs and eyes that ran down its limbs. Our baby son Jake also had X marks over his eyes. Michaela had written, "Mr. Patches says Jake will see him soon," at the bottom. We tried to stay calm and asked Michaela about the drawings. She instantly piped up and gave us the biggest smile we'd ever seen. "Yes, Daddy, isn't it great? Mr. Patches lives inside all of us now." My wife and I couldn't have left the room faster. Sarah actually hyperventilated and dropped to her knees sobbing, asking me what was wrong with our child. I didn't even know how to answer that question. Sarah and I felt helpless, and in the time we decided what to do with our baby, things took a turn I never expected. It began when our motion sensors started going off at 3 a.m. every morning. When I checked the security footage, I saw Michaela walking through the house, opening windows and unlocking doors. She'd stand there and smile creepily while gesturing for something or someone to come in. She waited a couple seconds and then closed the door and hugged thin air. I was so scared of who she was becoming, I didn't even know how to talk to her about it, so I just didn't. Until later that day, when Michaela tried to unalive our newborn baby. It was feeding time, and Sarah looked away for 1 second. That was all it took for Michaela to sneak in some eye drops into his sippy cup. She hid the drops behind her back and smiled innocently as she said it was just water. Sarah got scared and threw the cup into the sink. She opened her mouth to scold Michaela, but she hit her to it. "You're ruining everything, I fucking hate you!" She screamed so loudly I thought the windows were going to shatter. Sarah instantly trembled. I'd never seen her look at Michaela with fear before. It was then that I realized we had let things go too far. I told Michaela she needed to apologize to her mom and that she couldn't continue being like this. What she was doing was causing us harm. I braced myself for her to burst into tears or even just to go nonverbal, but no. Instead, she lunged at Sarah and scratched her face until red was showing. "You're just jealous because he loves me more than you." As soon as I got her off, she ran to her room and barricaded the door with her dresser. From the outside, I could hear her repeating, "I'm sorry, I love you. I'm sorry, I love you," over and over. At that point, Michaela was the least of my worries. I took Sarah to urgent care and got her patched up. She kept asking me to help our daughter, that she wasn't being herself. I told her we would handle it as soon as we made sure she was okay. I wish I had known that it was the last time I'd ever see my daughter again. The girl I saw the next day wasn't Michaela, or not really anyway. I was fast asleep at 2 a.m. when I heard static on the baby monitor. My heart was pounding as I ran to Jake's room at full speed, wondering what Michaela had done to him now. From the hallway, I could spot a large shadow emerging by his crib. What I saw next made my insides twist. Michaela was standing over his crib with scissors in her hands. Her eyes were completely unfocused, like she was sleepwalking. "Mr. Patches says if we fix his eyes, he can always see him," she said. I tried to grab the scissors, but she fought harder than I'd ever seen her fight. She kept crying, "Mr. Patches says this is the only way he'll forgive me. He says Jake needs to see him." I could hear the sirens outside. Michaela kept cackling and repeating, "He's touching your shoulder right now, Daddy. Can't you feel his fingers?" The cold metal of the scissors pressed against my palm as I finally wrenched them from Michaela's grip. My hands shook as I threw them across the room, far from both children. Jake's terrified wails filled the nursery while Michaela thrashed in my arms, her small body possessed by a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a 7-year-old. I carried her kicking and screaming to her bedroom, my heart breaking with each step. Sarah met us in the hallway, her face still bandaged from earlier, and together we managed to get Michaela into her room. She immediately began throwing things at us. Books, toys, anything within reach. We retreated to the hallway and held the door shut while she pounded against it from the inside. Through the door, we could hear her voice change, dropping to that deeper tone she used for Mr. Patches, then back to her normal voice, pleading and crying. The conversation she was having with her imaginary friend sent chills down my spine. Sarah pressed her face against my shoulder, her body trembling. The sirens I'd heard earlier grew louder, then stopped. Our neighbor must have called after hearing the commotion. I left Sarah holding the door and went to explain to the officers that everything was under control, that our daughter was having a difficult night, but we were handling it as a family matter. They seemed skeptical, but eventually left after I assured them multiple times that everyone was safe. When I returned, Sarah had moved Jake's crib into our bedroom. She'd also pushed our heavy dresser against Michaela's door from the outside. The pounding had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. We spent the rest of the night taking turns watching Jake, neither of us able to sleep. Morning came with Michaela singing softly in her room. It was a lullaby she used to sing to Jake, but the words were different now. She sang about eyes that could see everything, about friends who lived in the walls, about babies who needed to be fixed. Sarah made breakfast while I stood guard outside Michaela's door, listening to every sound. When I finally opened the door, Michaela was sitting in the middle of her room, surrounded by more drawings. These were worse than before. The dark figure of Mr. Patches dominated every page, his multiple arms reaching toward crude drawings of our family. In some pictures, Jake had no no eyes at all. In others, Mr. Patches seemed to be emerging from inside our bodies. Michaela looked up at me with a sweet smile that made my stomach turn. She acted as if nothing had happened the night before. When I asked her about the scissors, she tilted her head confused and said she didn't remember any scissors. But then her expression darkened, and she added that Mr. Patches remembered everything. I gathered up all the drawings while she watched silently. As I reached for the last one, she grabbed my wrist with surprising force. Her fingernails dug into my skin as she whispered that Mr. Patches didn't like when people touched his pictures. I pulled away and left quickly, locking the door behind me. Sarah and I huddled in the kitchen, trying to figure out our next move. We couldn't keep Michaela locked in her room forever, but we also couldn't risk Jake's safety. Sarah suggested taking Jake to her mother's house for a few days while we dealt with Michaela, but I worried about separating our family. We were still discussing options when we heard Michaela's door open. The dresser we'd pushed against it lay on its side in the hallway. Michaela stood in her doorway, still in her pajamas from the night before. She walked past us without a word and went to the kitchen, where she calmly poured herself a bowl of cereal. Sarah and I watched in stunned silence as she ate breakfast like any other morning. After finishing her cereal, Michaela turned to us and announced that Mr. Patches had told her the rules. If we followed the rules, everything would be fine. The rules were simple: no locked doors, no taking Jake away, and no more talking about Mr. Patches unless he wanted us to. She recited these rules in a monotone voice, like she was reading from a script. I started to protest, but Michaela's face contorted into an expression of pure rage. She swept her bowl off the table, sending it crashing to the floor. Then, just as quickly, her face returned to that eerily calm expression. She stepped over the broken ceramic and went back to her room. Sarah began packing a bag for Jake while I cleaned up the mess. We'd decided that getting him somewhere safe was our first priority. Something feels off about how quickly the parents went from thinking Mr. Patches was helping their lonely daughter to suddenly discovering those disturbing drawings. I wonder if there were warning signs they missed or chose to ignore because they were just so happy she finally had a friend. As I swept up the ceramic shards, I noticed Michaela watching from the hallway. She didn't say anything, just stared with those unfocused eyes. The rest of the morning was a tense dance of trying to act normal while keeping Jake away from Michaela. She followed us from room to room, always maintaining a few feet of distance, but never letting us out of her sight. When Sarah tried to dress Jake, Michaela stood in the doorway, humming that twisted lullaby. I suggested taking Michaela outside to play, hoping to give Sarah time to leave with Jake, but Michaela refused to go anywhere without her baby brother. She said Mr. Patches wanted them to stay together. When I tried to insist, she began scratching at her own arms until they turned red. I backed off immediately. By afternoon, the situation had become unbearable. Michaela had positioned herself in the living room, where she could see both the front door and the hallway to the bedrooms. She sat there with a pile of Jake's toys, arranging them in strange patterns on the floor. Every time we tried to move Jake, she would start that horrible screaming again. Sarah finally broke down. She confronted Michaela directly, kneeling in front of her and trying to reason with her. She told Michaela how much we loved her, how we wanted to help her, how Mr. Patches wasn't real and couldn't hurt us. Michaela listened silently, then reached out and touched Sarah's bandaged face with disturbing gentleness. The touch seemed to trigger something in Michaela. Her whole body began to shake, and tears streamed down her face. For a moment, I saw my little girl again, scared and confused. She collapsed into Sarah's arms, sobbing and apologizing over and over. Sarah held her tight, crying too, and I felt a spark of hope that maybe we could reach her. But the moment passed quickly. Michaela suddenly went rigid in Sarah's arms. Her crying stopped abruptly, and she pushed Sarah away with violent force. She stood up and announced that Mr. Patches was very angry now. He didn't like being called not real. He was going to show us just how real he was. Michaela walked to the center of the living room and began spinning in slow circles, her arms outstretched. Her movements were mechanical, puppet-like. Sarah and I watched frozen as she completed 3 full rotations before stopping abruptly. She tilted her head at an unnatural angle and stared directly at the corner of the ceiling. I followed her gaze but saw nothing. The hair on my arms stood up as Michaela nodded slowly, as if receiving instructions. She then walked to the bookshelf and began pulling books out one by one, examining each cover before tossing it aside. Sarah clutched Jake tighter, backing toward the hallway. The systematic way Michaela searched through our belongings sent ice through my veins. She moved from the bookshelf to the entertainment center, opening every drawer and cabinet. Her small hands worked with disturbing precision, never rushing, never hesitating. When she found what she was looking for, an old photo album, she smiled that same sweet smile that no longer reached her eyes. She flipped through the pages until she found our wedding photos. Her finger traced over Sarah's face in each picture, pressing harder with each image until she was scratching at the photos themselves. I stepped forward to stop her, but she sensed my movement and clutched the album to her chest. Sarah made a decision. While Michaela was distracted with the photos, she slipped down the hallway with Jake. I heard our bedroom door close softly and the click of the lock. Michaela's head snapped up at the sound. She dropped the album and started toward the hallway, but I blocked her path. She tried to dodge around me, but I matched her movements. Her frustration grew with each blocked attempt. Finally, she stopped and looked up at me with those unfocused eyes. Her mouth opened and closed several times, as if she was having a silent conversation. Then she nodded and returned to the living room. I thought I'd won a small victory until I saw her dragging a kitchen chair toward the hallway. She positioned it against the wall and climbed up, reaching for the air vent near the ceiling. Her small fingers worked at the screws with her fingernails. I pulled her down, chair and all, but she immediately scrambled back up. This continued for what felt like hours, me pulling her down, her climbing back up. Each time she seemed less like my daughter and more like something else wearing her skin. Her movements became increasingly erratic. Her breathing labored. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool temperature. Sarah emerged from the bedroom, having settled Jake in his crib. She surveyed the scene, the scattered books, torn photos, overturned chair, and her face hardened with determination. She approached Michaela slowly, hands visible and empty. Michaela watched her mother's approach with the intensity of a predator. When Sarah got within arm's reach, Michaela lunged, not at Sarah, but past her, racing toward our bedroom. Sarah and I gave chase, but Michaela had always been fast. She reached our door and began pounding on it with both fists. The pounding had a rhythm to it. 3 quick beats, pause, 2 slow beats, pause, repeat. It was deliberate, purposeful. From inside the room, Jake began crying. Michaela's pounding intensified, her knuckles turning red from the impact. I grabbed her around the waist and carried her away from the door, her legs kicking wildly. She went limp in my arms, becoming dead weight. I adjusted my grip, and that's when she struck. Her elbow connected with my solar plexus, knocking the wind out of me. I doubled over, releasing her. She sprinted back to the door, but Sarah intercepted her. The struggle that followed was heartbreaking. Mother and daughter grappling in the hallway, Sarah trying to restrain without hurting, Michaela fighting with no such reservations. She bit, scratched, and kicked. Sarah's bandages came loose, revealing the angry red marks from the previous attack. I recovered and helped Sarah carry Michaela back to the living room. We set her on the couch, each holding an arm. She sat perfectly still between us, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Then she began to hum, the same twisted lullaby from earlier, but slower, more deliberate. As she hummed, her body temperature seemed to drop. Her skin felt cold and clammy under my grip. Sarah noticed it too, her eyes widening with concern. We exchanged worried glances over Michaela's head. This was beyond normal childhood behavior, beyond even psychological disturbance. The humming stopped. Michaela turned to look at me, then at Sarah. Her eyes were completely dilated, the pupils so large her irises were barely visible. She smiled, showing all her teeth. Then she spoke in that deeper voice, the one she used for Mr. Patches, but this time it came from her own mouth without her lips moving properly. The words were garbled, incomprehensible, but the tone was clear, threatening, ancient, wrong. Sarah's grip on Michaela's arm loosened in shock. That was all the opportunity needed. Michaela wrenched free and ran to the kitchen. We found her standing on the counter, reaching for the knife block. I swept it out of reach just as her fingers brushed the handles. She spun toward me, nearly losing her balance. Sarah caught her as she fell, and we carried her thrashing form back to the living room. This pattern continued throughout the day. Michaela would seem to calm down, we'd relax slightly, and she'd make another attempt to get to Jake or find something dangerous. Each attempt was more creative than the last. She tried to climb out windows, unscrew light fixtures, access the garage through the laundry room. By evening, Sarah and I were exhausted. We'd skipped lunch, afraid to let our guard down long enough to eat. Jake needed feeding, but we couldn't risk taking him out of the locked bedroom with Michaela watching our every move. We were at an impasse. That's when Michaela did something unexpected. She walked to her toy chest and pulled out her favorite stuffed rabbit. She'd had it since she was a baby, carried it everywhere until recently. She held it up, examining it as if seeing it for the first time. Then she began pulling out the stuffing. She worked methodically, creating a pile of white fluff on the floor. When the rabbit was empty, she turned it inside out and put it on her head like a grotesque hat. She looked at us expectantly, as if waiting for a reaction. When we didn't provide one, she shrugged and began gathering the stuffing. She shaped the fluff into small balls and arranged them in a circle on the floor. In the center, she placed Jake's favorite pacifier. How she'd gotten it, I had no idea. She sat cross-legged beside her creation and closed her eyes. Her lips moved in silent conversation. Sarah used this distraction to slip back to our bedroom. I heard her talking softly to Jake, probably feeding him. I kept watch over Michaela, who remained motionless except for her moving lips. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. As darkness fell, Michaela's behavior shifted again. She abandoned her stuffing circle and began turning on every light in the house. She moved room to room, flipping switches, plugging in lamps, even turning on flashlights and setting them around. Soon, our home was blazing with light. She returned to the living room and surveyed her work with satisfaction. Then she went to the front door and began unlocking it. I relocked it. She unlocked it again. This went on until I physically held the deadbolt in place. She gave up and moved to the windows. One by one, she unlatched every window in the house. I followed behind, relatching them. It was like a twisted game, but her expression remained deadly serious. When she tried every window, she returned to the first one and started again. Sarah emerged from the bedroom looking haggard. We needed a plan. We couldn't continue this indefinitely. Michaela's going through every creepy child trick in the book, spinning like a broken toy, climbing walls, turning the house into a lighthouse. Someone should tell her less is more when haunting your family. She suggested calling her sister, maybe taking shifts so one of us could sleep, but Michaela must have sensed our planning. She positioned herself between us and the phone. The night wore on in a blur of constant vigilance. Michaela's attempts became more frantic as the hours passed. She tried to barricade us in separate rooms, to stack furniture to reach high places, to access the attic through the hall closet. Each failure seemed to fuel her determination. Around midnight, she suddenly stopped. She stood in the center of the living room, swaying slightly. Her eyes rolled back, showing only whites. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. Then she collapsed. Sarah rushed to her, checking her pulse and breathing. Both were rapid but strong. We carried her to her bed, hoping exhaustion had finally overtaken whatever was driving her. We took turns, standing guard at her door while the other checked on Jake, but Michaela wasn't done. At 3 a.m. exactly, she sat bolt upright in bed. Her movements were mechanical as she stood and walked to her door. She tried the handle, found it locked from the outside, and began scratching at the wood. The sound was rhythmic, methodical, maddening. The scratching continued for exactly 1 hour, then silence. Sarah and I held our breath, waiting. The doorknob rattled violently, then nothing. We heard her window slide open. I ran outside to find her halfway out, her small body contorting to fit through the opening. I pushed her back inside and nailed the window shut. The sound of the hammer seemed to enrage her. She flew at me, all fingernails and teeth. I held her at arm's length while she flailed. Sarah appeared with a blanket, and we wrapped her tightly, creating a makeshift straitjacket. We sat with her on her bed, one on each side, as she struggled against the blanket. Her strength was unnatural for her size. The blanket started to tear. We rewrapped her, using sheets this time. She chewed through them. Dawn broke with all three of us exhausted. Michaela had finally stopped struggling, but her eyes remained open, unblinking. She lay between us like a statue, only the rise and fall of her chest indicating life. Sarah stroked her hair, tears streaming down her face. When the sun was fully up, Michaela blinked. She turned to look at Sarah, then at me. For a moment, her eyes seemed clear. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then her face contorted. She began convulsing, her body rigid and shaking. The seizure lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. When it ended, she lay still, breathing heavily. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful. We waited, afraid to move, afraid to hope. Then she opened her eyes and smiled. Not the sweet smile of our daughter, but that other smile, the wrong smile. She sat up slowly, the torn sheets falling away. She looked at her hands as if surprised to see them. Then she looked at us with an expression of mild curiosity. She tilted her head, studying our faces. When she spoke, her voice was her own, but the words were not. She told us Mr. Patches was disappointed. We hadn't followed the rules. Now things would have to change. She stood and walked calmly to her dresser, pulling out clothes. She dressed herself with careful precision, choosing items she'd never worn torn together before. Sarah and I watched, unsure how to respond to this new development. Michaela seemed calm, controlled, but somehow that was worse than her frantic behavior. She finished dressing and turned to face us, hands clasped in front of her like a miniature adult. She informed us that Mr. Patches had decided to be more direct. No more games, no more warnings. If we didn't give him what he wanted, he would take it. She delivered this message in a matter-of-fact tone, as if discussing the weather. I asked what Mr. Patches wanted. Michaela's smile widened. She walked to her toy chest and pulled out a piece of paper and crayons. She began drawing with quick, sure strokes. When she finished, she held up the picture. It showed Jake, but his eyes were scribbled out with black crayon. Sarah snatched the drawing and tore it up. Michaela watched impassively, then began drawing another and another, each image more disturbing than the last. Jake with X's for eyes. Jake surrounded by dark figures. Jake alone in darkness. We gathered up the drawings as fast as she could make them. She didn't seem bothered by this, just kept creating more. Her crayon moved across the paper with inhuman speed. Soon, the floor was littered with torn pieces despite our efforts. The doorbell rang, startling all of us. Michaela's head snapped toward the sound. She dropped her crayon and walked purposefully toward the door. I intercepted her, holding her back while Sarah checked the peephole. It was the mailman with a package. Sarah signed for it quickly and closed the door. Michaela watched the entire interaction with intense focus. When the door closed, she nodded as if confirming something to herself. She returned to her drawing, but now she was sketching the mailman. The accuracy was unsettling. She'd only glimpsed him for seconds, but every detail was perfect. His uniform, his face, even the way he held his electronic signature pad. She drew him over and over, each image identical to the last. I realized we needed help, professional help. But Michaela seemed to sense my thoughts. She stopped drawing and fixed me with that unblinking stare. She shook her head slowly, deliberately. The message was clear. No outsiders. Sarah disappeared into our bedroom again to check on Jake. I heard her gasp. I rushed to see what was wrong, but Michaela blocked my path. Her small body shouldn't have been able to stop me, but something about her stance made me hesitate. Sarah emerged carrying Jake, her face pale. She showed me his sleeper. There were tiny handprints on it, too small to be Michaela's. They looked like infant handprints, but Jake's hands had been tucked inside. The prints were made with something dark and oily. Michaela clapped her hands in delight. She pointed at Jake, then at herself, then made a connecting gesture. Sarah clutched Jake tighter and backed away. Michaela's delight turned to frustration. She stamped her foot and returned to her drawings. This time she drew our house. Every room, every detail, laid out like a blueprint. But there were additions. Dark shapes in corners, shadows where shadows shouldn't be, and in every room, the figure of Mr. Patches watching. The day progressed in a tense standoff. Michaela continued her drawings while we took turns protecting Jake and watching her. She seemed content to draw for now, but we knew it wouldn't last. The pile of disturbing images grew higher. As afternoon approached, Michaela suddenly stopped drawing. She gathered all her pictures and began arranging them on the floor in a specific pattern. It looked like a map or a timeline. She studied her work, made a few adjustments, then sat back satisfied. She announced that Mr. Patches had shown her everything, past, present, and future. She knew what would happen if we didn't comply. She pointed to specific drawings as she explained, her voice taking on that eerie monotone quality. According to her, or rather Mr. Patches, Jake was special. He could see things others couldn't, but his sight was limited by his physical eyes. Mr. Patches wanted to fix that, to open Jake's true vision. The process was simple, she assured us. Jake wouldn't feel a thing. Sarah and I exchanged horrified looks. Our 7-year-old was calmly discussing mutilating her baby brother as if it were a medical procedure. I knelt beside her, trying once more to reach the daughter I knew was still in there somewhere. I reminded her of all our happy memories, her first day of school, teaching her to ride a bike, bedtime stories, and goodnight kisses. Her expression remained unchanged. I talked about how much we loved her, how we would always love her no matter what. For just a second, something flickered in her eyes, a trace of the real Michaela, but it was gone so fast I might have imagined it. She patted my hand condescendingly and told me those memories belonged to someone else now. She stood and began collecting her drawings. She stacked them neatly and placed them in her toy chest. Then she announced she was hungry. Such a normal request after such abnormal behavior. Sarah made her a sandwich while I stood guard. Michaela ate mechanically, taking identical bites and chewing the same number of times. When she finished, she wiped her mouth carefully and placed her plate in the sink. She thanked Sarah politely, her manners perfect, but somehow wrong. She returned to the living room and sat on the couch. She folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes. To anyone looking in, she would appear to be a well-behaved child taking a rest. But we knew better. We could see her lips moving slightly, continuing that endless conversation. As evening approached, the atmosphere grew heavier. Michaela opened her eyes and announced that Mr. Patches was getting impatient. He'd been very patient so far, but his patience had limits. She suggested we make our decision soon. Sarah asked what decision. Michaela smiled that wrong smile again. The decision to let Mr. Patches help Jake, of course. It would be so much easier if we cooperated. If we didn't, well, Mr. Patches had other ways, less pleasant ways. She stood and walked to the window. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in reds and purples. She pressed her palm against the glass and whispered something. When she removed her hand, there was an oily handprint left behind, just like the ones on Jake's sleeper. She turned back to us, her face serene. She informed us that Mr. Patches would visit tonight. He wanted to meet Jake properly. We could make it easy or hard, but it would happen either way. She recommended we choose easy. Sarah and I knew we had to act. We couldn't spend another night like the last one. While Michaela was distracted at the window, Sarah slipped back to our room. Michaela's drawing skills are way too good for a 7-year-old. Perfect details of the mailman after seeing him for just a few seconds. I'm really curious about what's making her able to do things she couldn't do before, like having this weird strength and artistic ability. I heard her on the phone, her voice low and urgent. She was calling her sister. Michaela must have heard too. She walked calmly to the kitchen and returned with scissors, not threatening us, just holding them casually. She sat back on the couch and began cutting shapes from paper. Each snip of the scissors was deliberate, measured. She cut out paper dolls, a family of 4, but the baby doll had no eyes, just empty holes where they should be. She held up her creation and made them dance, the eyeless baby doll leading the others in their paper dance. The paper dolls fluttered to the floor as Michaela stood abruptly. She walked to the hallway closet and began pulling out winter coats, despite the warm evening. She arranged them on the floor in a specific pattern, creating pathways between rooms. Sarah hung up on her sister mid-conversation, and we both watched, trying to decipher her intent. Michaela placed shoes at strategic points along her coat pathways, then stepped back to admire her work. She nodded with satisfaction action and began walking the paths, careful not to step outside the boundaries she'd created. At each shoe marker, she paused and performed a different gesture, touching her forehead, spinning in place, crouching down. I realized she was creating some kind of ritual. Sarah must have had the same thought because she rushed to gather up the coats. Michaela shrieked and threw herself at Sarah's legs, knocking her off balance. They tumbled to the floor together, Sarah protecting her injured face while Michaela clawed at the coats. I pulled Michaela away and she went limp again, using that same dead weight technique. This time I was ready for her elbow strike and shifted my grip. She tried biting my arm through my shirt. Her teeth couldn't penetrate the fabric, but the pressure was painful. I carried her to the bathroom and set her in the empty tub, hoping the confined space would calm her. Instead, she began turning the faucets, alternating between hot and cold water. Steam rose as the temperature fluctuated wildly. She cupped water in her hands and flung it at the walls, creating wet patterns. When I reached to turn off the water, she grabbed my wrist with both hands and dug her nails in deep enough to draw blood. Sarah appeared with towels, and we managed to get Michaela out of the tub. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her small frame. She shivered but smiled, water dripping from her hair. She announced that the preparations were almost complete. Mr. Patches would be so pleased. We got her into dry clothes while she remained unnaturally still, like dressing a mannequin. Her skin was cold to the touch despite the warm bath water. Once dressed, she walked calmly back to the living room and resumed her position on the couch, hands folded, eyes closed. The house felt different now. The air seemed heavier, shadows longer. Every small sound made us jump. Sarah and I took positions on either side of Michaela, ready for whatever came next. The waiting was agony. As darkness fell completely, Michaela's eyes snapped open. She stood and walked to the center of the room. She began moving her hands in complex patterns, like she was weaving invisible threads. Her movements were precise, practiced. How long had she been rehearsing this? She started speaking in that strange, garbled language again, her voice fluctuating between her normal tone and the deeper Mr. Patch's voice. The words seemed to hang in the air, making my skin crawl. Sarah grabbed my hand, her palms sweaty with fear. Michaela suddenly stopped mid-gesture. She cocked her head, listening to something we couldn't hear. Then she smiled and nodded. She turned to us with an expression of triumph. Mr. Patches had arrived. She walked toward our bedroom with purposeful steps. We followed, knowing we couldn't let her near Jake. At the door, she placed both palms flat against the wood and began pushing. Not pounding or hitting, just steady pressure. The door creaked under her small hands. I pulled her back and she spun around, her movements liquid and strange. She ducked under my arm and pressed against the door again. This time she began humming, the vibrations seeming to travel through the wood. From inside, Jake began crying. Sarah tried to lead Michaela away with gentle touches and soothing motions, but Michaela remained fixed at the door. Her humming grew louder, more insistent. The sound was wrong, making my teeth ache. Jake's cries intensified. That's when I noticed the smell, something oily and organic, like rotting vegetation mixed with machine oil. It seemed to emanate from Michaela herself. Sarah noticed too, her nose wrinkling in disgust. The smell grew stronger the louder Michaela hummed. We needed to break whatever hold Mr. Patches had on her. I remembered the drawings, how upset she'd been when I touched them. I ran to her room and grabbed her toy chest, bringing it to the hallway. I began pulling out all her Mr. Patches drawings. Michaela's humming stopped instantly. She whirled around, her face contorted with rage. She lunged for the drawings, but I held them high above her reach. She jumped and clawed at the air, making inhuman sounds of frustration. I started tearing the drawings. Each rip seemed to cause Michaela physical pain. She clutched her stomach, doubling over, but I kept tearing, destroying every image of Mr. Patches, every disturbing picture of Jake. Sarah watched in horror as our daughter writhed on the floor. When the last drawing was destroyed, Michaela went completely still. She lay on her side, knees drawn to her chest, breathing in short gasps. The terrible smell began to dissipate. Jake's crying slowed to whimpers. Sarah knelt beside Michaela, afraid to touch her. We waited, watching for any sign of movement. Finally, Michaela's breathing normalized. She slowly uncurled and sat up. When she looked at us, her eyes were focused, present, the real Michaela. She burst into tears, crawling into Sarah's arms. Her sobs were different now, the genuine cries of a frightened child, not the manipulative wails from before. She clung to Sarah, her small body shaking. Sarah held her tight, tears streaming down her own face. I unlocked our bedroom door and checked on Jake. He was fine, though clearly distressed. I brought him out, and Michaela looked at her baby brother with clear, loving eyes. She reached out tentatively, and Sarah allowed her to gently touch Jake's hand. The rest of the night was spent in vigilant calm. Michaela stayed close to us, occasionally shuddering as if shaking off a bad dream. She didn't speak about Mr. Patches or what had happened. When she finally fell asleep in Sarah's arms, it was the peaceful sleep of exhaustion. Over the following days, we maintained constant watch. Michaela showed no signs of her previous behavior. She was quieter than before, more clingy, but otherwise seemed like herself. She played with normal toys, drew happy pictures, and showed appropriate affection toward Jake. Sarah's sister came to stay with us, providing extra support and supervision. We baby-proofed the house to an extreme degree, installing locks and alarms on everything. Michaela didn't protest these changes, seeming to understand they were necessary. I researched child psychologists who specialized in trauma and dissociative behaviors. We needed professional help, but finding the right person was crucial. The first few consultations were disappointing. Doctors who wanted to immediately medicate or hospitalize. We needed someone who would work with our family. Finally, we found Dr. Chen, who agreed to intensive home sessions. She observed Michaela in her environment, building trust slowly. Michaela was hesitant at first, but gradually opened up. The therapy sessions were difficult, often leaving all of us emotionally drained. Dr. Chen explained that imaginary friends could sometimes become maladaptive coping mechanisms, especially in children struggling with social connections. The violent behavior suggested deeper issues that would take time to address. She recommended continued therapy and careful monitoring. Michaela began attending a new school, one with smaller classes and more individual attention. We were honest with the administration about her challenges, and they developed a support plan. She made friends slowly, supervised playdates that went well. At home, we established strict routines. Michaela thrived on predictability, knowing what to expect each day. She helped with simple chores, spent supervised time with Jake, and engaged in structured activities. The wild child who had terrorized us seemed like a distant nightmare, but we never forgot. Sarah and I took turns sleeping, always one parent parent awake and alert. We removed all scissors, sharp objects, and potentially dangerous items from Michaela's reach. Jake's nursery had multiple locks and a baby monitor with motion sensors. Months passed with steady improvement. Michaela's therapy sessions became less intense, more focused on building healthy coping skills. She learned to identify and express her emotions appropriately. The mention of Mr. Patches became rare, then stopped entirely. One evening, while tucking Michaela into bed, she grabbed my hand. She looked up at me with clear, serious eyes and apologized for scaring us. She said she knew Mr. Patches wasn't real now, that he had been her fear and loneliness talking. I hugged her tight, telling her we loved her no matter what. The healing wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments of regression, times when we saw shadows of the old behavior. But with consistency, therapy, and endless patience, our family found a new normal. Michaela grew stronger, more confident in healthy ways. Jake remained unharmed through it all, developing normally despite the early trauma. As he grew, we watched carefully for any signs of impact, but he seemed remarkably resilient. Michaela became a protective, appropriate big sister, their relationship healing over time. Our marriage survived, though scarred. Sarah and I attended counseling together, processing the trauma and fear we'd experienced. We learned to trust again, to believe in our daughter's recovery while remaining vigilant. The experience had changed us all. Years later, Michaela would have only vague memories of that terrifying period. The therapy had helped her process and move past it. She grew into a thoughtful, creative teenager with real friends and healthy relationships. Mr. Patches became nothing more than a shadowy memory from early childhood. We kept all the therapy records, documentation of that dark time, locked away but accessible if ever needed. The vigilance never fully left us. We remained alert to any signs of regression. But as time passed, those fears faded into background caution rather than active terror. Our family had survived something unimaginable. We'd fought for our daughter's mind and won, pulled her back from whatever dark place Mr. Patches had represented. It hadn't been easy or quick, but with love, professional help, and unwavering determination, we'd reclaimed our little girl. The house felt different now, lighter, safer. The shadows were just shadows, the night sounds just settling wood and wind. Michaela's laughter rang genuine and clear. Jake grew up knowing only his loving, protective sister. And Sarah and I learned that family could survive even the darkest moments if they faced them together. Well, thanks for letting me sort through all this weirdness with you. It's been a messy and confusing ride, but I'm glad we went through it together. Until next time, stay curious.